Hey guys, tonight we're going up into the Black Hills of South Dakota, past Keystone, where the gift shops sell Mount Rushmore in snow globes and fudge by the pound, through a cattle gate, up a faint path into the pines, to a burial ground that sits on no tourist map, where the markers have been carried off one by one, and where a woman from the Little House books has been lying without a name on her grave for more than 130 years. If you're new here, this is the channel where we dig up what famous books left in the ground, and we keep the receipts, letters, land deeds, census pages, grave records. If that's your kind of night, do one thing for me before we start. Hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it tells us to keep digging. That's the last favour I'll ask. Now, lights down. Let's open the file. You think the Little House books gave you the Ingalls family? Most of America thinks that. 8 novels, 60 million copies, a television show that ran 9 seasons and never really left the air. The story sold itself as a record. One true family, moving west, surviving everything the country threw at it. But a record keeps everyone, and the books did not. There was an aunt, Charles Ingalls' own sister, blood, not marriage. She was stitched into Laura's family twice over, because in one of the strangest arrangements on the Wisconsin frontier, Pa's sister married Ma's brother. Her children and Laura were double cousins, closer in blood than most people's siblings-in-law will ever be. She lived 7 miles from the cabin where Laura was born. Her husband helped butcher the hog in chapter 1 of the first book. Her son got an entire chapter to himself, and here is everything the books gave her. A borrowed butcher knife, a boy covered in stings, a wave from a railroad camp, then nothing, as if the family simply rode over the horizon and dissolved. They didn't dissolve, they went somewhere specific, and the proof sits today in the archive of the Wisconsin Historical Society. A letter dated November the 27th, 1884, mailed from a mining camp called Harney City, Dakota Territory, in the handwriting of Polly Ingalls Quiner. One sentence from that letter, and you'll understand why we're here tonight. We saw our own dear children fade and die, 3 of them in less than 1 short month. 3 children, 1 month, a 22-year-old, a 13-year-old, a 10-year-old. Laura Ingalls Wilder published 8 novels about her family and left an autobiography in a drawer. That sentence is in none of them. The deaths are in none of them. The camp, the epidemic, the graves, the aunt who wrote the letter. None of it. Anywhere. Ever. So tonight runs on 2 questions. The first is simple. What actually happened to Aunt Polly's family out there in the hills? The record answers that one, and the answer is worse than you're expecting. The second question is the one that should bother you long after the video ends. Laura knew. She was 17 when the news reached her family's house in De Smet. She carried her cousin's story in her head for the rest of her life. We can prove that, and we will. She chose every time to tell a different version. Why? To understand what was cut, you have to watch the thing get built first. And on this frontier, it gets built the way these things always get built, with a funeral and a boat. Start with the boat. In November of 1845, a trader named Henry Newcomb Quiner was working the late-season run on Lake Michigan, the last freight window before ice closed the lakes for the winter. Late November on that water is a gamble every sailor understood. The storms come down from Canada fast. The temperature drops through the floor, and a loaded schooner has nowhere to hide. Somewhere off the Straits of Mackinac, a storm caught his vessel. He did not come home. Back in Wisconsin, his wife Charlotte was left holding a farm she could not run alone, and 6 children she now had to feed by herself. Joseph was 11. Henry, the boy who matters most to tonight's story, was 9. Martha was 8. Caroline, the little girl America would one day know as Ma Ingalls, had just turned 5. Eliza was 3. Thomas was barely walking. 60 million readers know what Caroline Ingalls became. Almost none of them know she was a fatherless 5-year-old whose family spent the next several years close to the edge of actual hunger. The Quiners moved to Concord Township in Jefferson County and survived the way widow families survived in the 1840s, by shrinking. Less land, less food. Children doing adult work years before their bodies were ready for it, because the alternative was charity, and charity in that decade had a way of splitting families apart. Mark what that does to a 9-year-old boy. Henry Odin Quiner spent his childhood as the second man of a house, with no man in it, ploughing at an age when the plough handles hit him at the collarbone, hauling wood through Wisconsin winters in clothing that never quite dried. He grew up steady, careful, allergic to risk, and hold on to that because 40 years from now, the one gamble Henry Quiner ever takes is going to kill almost everyone he loves. In 1849, Charlotte remarried, a farmer named Frederick Holbrook, and the household finally stopped bleeding. The children grew, the farm held, and then, around 1853, a wagon family rolled into the neighborhood from the east, and the other half of this story arrived in Jefferson County. The Ingalls family came out of Cuba Township in Allegheny County, New York. Hill country, hard soil, the kind of farms that kept a man permanently 6 months behind on his debts. Lansford Whiting Ingalls and his wife Laura had 10 children across those years, and they moved the way stretched-thin families moved, in stages, west, chasing cheaper land, New York, then Illinois, then Wisconsin. Their 5th child was a girl, born October 14th, 1840, back in Cuba. The records that survive spell her name a few different ways. Polly Malona in most places, Pauline in others. Everyone who actually knew her said Polly. She was about 12 when the family settled in Jefferson County, 13 when she would have first crossed paths with the Quiner Holbrook household across the Oconomowoc River. And here the record gives us one of its small mercies, because for once we know the geography of a courtship. The Ingalls land sat near that river, and the researcher Nancy Cleveland, who has spent decades reconstructing this family from paper, notes that the water and the path along it were the familiar sites of Henry and Polly's courting years. A boy who had been the man of the house since age 9. A girl from a family that never stopped owing somebody money. Walking the same riverbank in a township small enough that every unmarried person knew every other unmarried person by name. There were 2 big families on that water now. One had too many debts. One had too many memories. Both had a surplus of teenagers and a shortage of everything else. On the frontier, that math solves itself. It solved itself 3 times. The first solution came in the winter of 1859, in a courtroom, of all places, and the clerk who recorded it had no idea he was writing the opening line of a story 60 million people would one day think they knew. February 15th, 1859. The day after Valentine's Day, in the Justice Court at Concord, Wisconsin, a clerk recorded the marriage of Henry Odin Quiner, 23, to Polly Malona Ingalls, 18. No church, no documented dress, no documented flowers, no documented guests. A winter courtroom, a legal formula, 2 signatures, and the first plank of the structure this whole story stands on. People hear courtroom wedding in February and assume something cold. Look closer at what it actually tells you. A church. Wedding cost money and time in the social season. A justice court wedding cost a fee and an afternoon. Henry Quiner was a man who had watched his mother nearly lose everything to one piece of bad luck on a lake. He did not spend on ceremony what could be spent on seed. And Polly Ingalls came from a family that had been outrunning debt across 3 states. These were 2 people who had every reason to believe that survival was a budget, and sentiment was a line item you cut first. That sounds bleak. It wasn't. And the proof is in what happened next, because this marriage didn't stay a private arrangement. It started a chain reaction. 11.5 months later, on February 1st, 1860, Polly's brother Charles, 24 years old, quick-handed, famous in the neighbourhood for his fiddle, stood up in Concord and married Henry's little sister Caroline. The fatherless 5-year-old from the lake story was now a trained schoolteacher, with a composed face and a spine of forged iron, and she was marrying into the same family her brother had married into a year before. Then Peter Ingalls, another of Polly's brothers, married Eliza Quiner, a 3rd brother-sister pairing across the same 2 households, and the knot was complete. Stop and look at the architecture, because there is nothing quite like it anywhere else in the Little House universe. 3 Ingalls siblings married 3 Quiner siblings. 2 families fused into a single organism with one shared bloodline. The children of Henry and Polly and the children of Charles and Caroline would be double first cousins, related through both their fathers and their mothers, sharing as much blood as half-siblings. When Laura Ingalls was eventually born into this web, her cousin Charlie wasn't some distant relative she saw at Christmas. Biologically, he was nearly a brother. Why does a community produce marriages like that? You can write it as romance, 3 love stories under 2 roofs. Some of it surely was. But frontier Wisconsin in 1859 was also a place with a brutally small social pool, where a family's labour supply was its survival margin, and where marrying your siblings' in-laws meant your harvest crew, your loan network, and your emergency plan all lived within walking distance. The Ingalls family brought hands and hustle. The Quiner-Holbrook family brought stability and land sense. Every wedding was also a merger, and mergers get tested. The first test came almost immediately, and it came wearing a uniform. In 1861, the war reached Wisconsin, and the Quiner family, which had already given 1 man to Lake Michigan, gave another to the Union Army. Joseph Quiner, the oldest brother, the 11-year-old from the funeral year, marched south with a Wisconsin regiment. In April 1862, he went down wounded at the Battle of Shiloh. He did not recover. So before this story even leaves Jefferson County, understand the arithmetic Polly Quiner had already lived. Her father-in-law drowned. Her husband's brother, dead of a battlefield wound. 2 families that had buried their way into adulthood. When people from this world said they wanted land, peace, and to be left alone, they were not reciting a slogan. They were describing the only 2 things the century had refused to give them. Polly's first daughter, Louisa, arrived in 1860. Her first son, Charles Henry, named for both grandfathers, called Charlie by everyone, arrived in 1862, weeks apart from the war news. 2 babies in a rented corner of a crowded county, while her husband and her brother worked other men's margins. But the brothers-in-law had a plan. Henry had patience, and Charles had nerve. And together, and this is the part the books never explain, they had enough for exactly 1 farm. So in 1863, they bought 1 farm, and they cut it in half. Nobody romanticizes a farm you share with your in-laws, except one person did. She did it so well that the cabin on that farm is now a national shrine with a replica and a wayside marker and a gift shop selling sunbonnets. What the marker does not tell the tourists is that the famous little house in the big woods stood on the south half of a property whose north half belonged to Aunt Polly, and that the warm, self-sufficient world of that first beloved book was never one family's homestead. It was a 2-family operation from the first dollar. The deed reads like this. In 1863, Henry Quiner and Charles Ingalls jointly purchased 160 acres in Pepin County, Wisconsin, the southwest quarter of Section 27, Township 24, Range 15, about 7 miles up from the village of Pepin and the great frozen lake below it. Henry and Polly settled the North 80. Charles and Caroline took the South 80. One boundary line, invisible, somewhere in the maples, and across it for a decade flowed seed, tools, labour, meat, milk, childcare, and gossip, in both directions, because that was the entire design. This was the big woods. Not metaphorically, the actual woods of the actual book. Bears in the corn, panthers in the dark, wolves running the ridgelines in winter. 7 miles from town meant 7 miles from a doctor, which meant that for any emergency measured in minutes rather than hours, the only help that existed was the family across the line fence. Now watch how tightly these 2 households actually breathed together. In the autumn of 1864, both kitchens on that quarter section had a pregnant woman in them. Polly was carrying her 3rd, Caroline was carrying her 1st. James Albert Quiner arrived on November 13, 1864, and Mary Amelia Ingalls followed on January 10, 1865, 8 weeks later. 2 infants, 1 farm, 1 winter. 2 mothers trading the only expertise that mattered, in a place where one fever, one bad birth, one frozen water bucket could end either story overnight. 2 years after that, on February 7th, 1867, in the cabin on the South 80, Carolyn delivered her second daughter, Laura. Sit with this, because the books never say it plainly. The most famous frontier child in American literature was born onto Aunt Polly's farm, or near enough that the difference wouldn't survive a walk of 10 minutes. The first faces around her that weren't her parents belonged to Quiners. The first big boys she ever watched were Polly's sons. The first woman who wasn't Ma, the first lap, the first spare set of hands on washing day, the first voice through the trees, was, in all likelihood, Polly. The record can't give us a diary entry that proves the babysitting. It gives us something better, geography and a fence line you could see across. And what was Polly's actual life on that North 80? Strip away every postcard image and count it out. By 1867, she had 4 children. Louisa, 7, Charlie, 5, Albert, 3, baby Charlotte, called Lottie, born that same year. The work attached to that household ran from before light to after dark. Fires, water, hogs, hens, a garden measured in survival rather than pleasure, lye soap that burned the cracks in your hands, wool to card and spin, bread every single day, laundry that took a full day of hauling and boiling, and the permanent background arithmetic of flour and salt pork against the length of a Wisconsin winter. The books made this world cozy. The cozy was real, and it was manufactured daily by the women out of nothing at a cost the books billed to nobody. Here's where I remind you what failure looked like, because this is the stake hanging over every chapter of this story. There was no floor under these people, no insurance, no bank account, no safety net the county was obliged to provide. If the man broke a leg in July, the crop died, and the family wintered on charity. If the woman died in childbirth, the household dissolved, and the children were parcelled out to relatives. Every quiet year on that farm was a successful high-wire act, performed without anyone watching. For 5 years the act worked, 2 crops, 2 cabins, cousins thick as siblings raised within shouting distance of each other in the deep timber. Then, in 1868, Charles Ingalls looked up from the South 80 and decided the big woods were getting crowded. You know this rhythm if you know anything about Pa. The fiddle, the far-off look, the speech about elbow room. The books play it as poetry. Polly got to experience it as logistics, because when Charles found a buyer, the sale didn't just move his family. The 2 farms were one machine, and you cannot sell half a machine. So, in 1868, both names went on the paperwork again. Henry Quiner and Charles Ingalls sold the Pepin land and bought together, sight unseen, in a place none of their children had ever spoken of, Chariton County, Missouri. The machine was leaving Wisconsin, and somewhere in the move it was going to break. Nobody wrote down why Missouri failed. That silence is worth noticing, because this family generated paper everywhere it went. Deeds, tax rolls, census lines, church registers. For the Missouri year, the trail goes thin. We know the 2 brothers-in-law sold the Pepin Quarter section in 1868. We know they bought land together in Chariton County, Missouri, rolling, settled, softer country than the Wisconsin timber. We know wagons went south with at least 9 children between the 2 households, Polly's 4 and Carolyn's 3 plus whatever the road added, and we know that within roughly a year, the whole arrangement came apart. What the record shows next is 2 families doing opposite things, and if you want to understand Henry and Polly Quiner, this is the moment that defines them. Charles and Carolyn kept going, south and west off the map of legal settlement entirely, down into Indian Territory in Kansas, onto land that still belonged, by treaty and by plain occupation, to the Osage. That gamble became the book the whole franchise is named for. It nearly got the family killed, it ended in retreat, and the books turned even the retreat into music. Henry and Polly turned around. They went back north, back up the same roads, back to the exact piece of Wisconsin they had just left. And on November 30th, 1869, Henry Quiner repurchased his own North 80 in Pepin County. The same trees, the same line fence, the same soil he'd already broken once. Picture the accounting in that decision. A man buys back his own farm at the cost of 2 long-distance moves, a failed year, and whatever Missouri took out of him, because somewhere on that southern road, Henry Quiner ran the numbers on adventure and concluded he wanted no further part of it. That is the crack in the machine, not a fight. No record suggests a fight, a divergence. Charles Ingalls was a man who heard a better country calling from the next county over, his whole life without exception. Henry Quiner was a man who had been the boy at his mother's table after the lake took his father, and what he wanted was the thing he'd lost at 9 years old. One place, one roof, known ground. For 10 years their partnership had braided those two instincts together. Missouri cut the braid. And Polly? Her vote isn't in any document. Women's votes from 1869 rarely are. But watch her household instead of waiting for a diary. It goes home, it stays home, and for the next decade it does not follow Charles Ingalls anywhere. Her 5th child, George, arrived in 1871, born onto repurchased ground. Hold that pattern in your mind. The Quiners do not follow Charles, because 10 years from now, the one time they break the pattern, it will cost them nearly everything. Meanwhile, the South 80 came back to life. The Kansas gamble had collapsed. The man who'd bought Charles's half, a Swedish immigrant named Gustav Gustafsson, stopped making his payments, and in 1871 Charles took the farm back and rolled his family up the long road from Indian Territory to the big woods. 2 wagons, 2 tired parents, and a 4-year-old girl named Laura with her first journey already behind her. So by the summer of 1871, the machine was reassembled. Quiners on the north half, Ingalls on the south half. Cousins across the fence again. Louisa 11, Charlie 9, Albert 7, Lottie 4, baby George, and on the other side Mary 6, Laura 4, baby Carrie. These reunion years, 1871 to 1873, are the world of Little House in the Big Woods. Not the family's first Pepin chapter, the second one. The book stitched both periods into one golden continuum and sanded the Missouri crack out of existence, which is why no reader in 60 million ever asks why Uncle Henry's family is just there, fully formed in Chapter 1 like furniture. And it's from these reunion years that the most famous image of Polly's family comes. One scene, one boy, one swarm. It is the only story about her son that America has ever been told, and Laura was still retelling it, as a parable, when the boy in it had been dead for 35 years. It happens at noon, in oat harvest heat, in Uncle Henry's field. August. The grain dead ripe, the air full of chaff. 2 men working against weather, because ripe oats do not wait, and a single storm could flatten a winter's worth of feed into the mud. Pa had crossed the line fence to help Henry bring the harvest in. That was the standing arrangement. Work traded for work, the machine doing what the machine was built to do. With them came Charlie, Polly's oldest son, about 11 in the book's telling, finally big enough to fetch, carry, water and rake. You probably know what the book says happened next. Charlie got bored. He screamed, and both men dropped everything and ran, because an 11-year-old screaming in a frontier field means a snake, a cut, a broken bone, something measured in minutes. They found him laughing at them. He did it again. They ran again, laughing. A third time, the same. So, when the 4th scream came, longer, higher, genuinely wrong, the 2 men straightened up, looked at each other, and went back to work. The screaming kept on. Finally they walked over, in their own time, expecting the joke. Charlie had jumped onto a yellow jacket nest. The ground itself had come alive around his legs. By the time the men pulled him clear, he had been stung. The book is specific in its cold way. Over and over, everywhere, a boy swollen into something his own cousins would barely recognise. They did not race him home. The oats were standing, and the oats could not wait. That is the frontier's actual hierarchy of mercy, and the book reports it without blinking. When the field was done, Charlie was brought to the house, and the women took over. This is Polly's entrance, though the chapter never frames it as hers. Somebody pack the boy in cool, wet earth to pull the venom's heat. wrapped him head to foot in strips of cloth until only his face showed, and sat with him through a night that had to be counted breath by breath. The remedy is in the book. The hands doing the remedy belong to a woman the chapter barely bothers to see, and then comes the line that made this scene immortal and damned it at the same time. Pa's verdict on his nephew, wrapped, swollen, blind with stings. It served the little liar right. 5-year-old Laura, tucked in her trundle bed in the same book, turns the sentence over and can't make it fit. She didn't understand, she tells us, how Charlie could be a liar when he had not said a word. Now let's take this famous scene apart, because almost nobody ever does. And the seams are where Polly's real story has been hiding for 90 years. First seam, Laura wasn't in that field. She was somewhere between 4 and 6 years old, a fence line away, in a kitchen. We know exactly how the story reached her, because she told us herself decades later in print. My father came in from the harvest field one day at noon, and with great glee told what had befallen my cousin Charlie. With great glee. Mark those 3 words. This is not a trauma report. This is Charles Ingalls, a born performer, the most charming man in any county he ever lived in, coming in at dinner with material. The stinging of Polly's son entered family history as entertainment, shaped in the telling, polished in the retelling, with a moral already bolted on. Second seam, the moral itself is borrowed. Scholars who annotated Laura's papers put it plainly. Father and daughter both knew their Aesop. The boy who cried wolf, the liar not believed when the wolf finally comes, the punishment arriving with the precision of a fable in 3 false alarms and a 4th real one. Whatever actually happened in Henry Quiner's oatfield that day, and something certainly happened, it has come down to us pre-shaped as a lesson, with the body count of a children's story and a real child's body in the middle of it. Third seam, and this is the one that should stop you cold. In June of 1919, in her column for a Missouri farm paper, a 52-year-old Laura Ingalls Wilder reached for a story to explain why Germany, after 4 years of broken promises, could never be trusted at a peace table. The story she reached for was Charlie and the Yellow Jackets. Boys or men or nations, she wrote. It seems to be the same. Prove yourself a liar often enough, and nobody believes you when you finally tell the truth. Her cousin, her double cousin, as near to a brother as blood can engineer without being one, 35 years in his grave by the time she wrote that column. And the use she found for him, the only use she ever found for him, in 1919 and again in 1932 when she fixed him into the book forever, was as the cautionary boy, the deserving liar, a fable with his face on it. She knew how he actually died. Hold on to that. We'll get there, and when we do, you can decide for yourself what you think of the fable. But notice, before we leave this field, who else the scene never sees? The chapter watches the men run. It watches the children stare at the wrapped figure on the bed. It hands Pa the punchline. At no point does the most famous children's book of the American frontier spend one sentence on the woman whose kitchen became a sick room, whose boy was breathing through swollen lips under those wrappings, and who had to listen, then and presumably for years, to the family's official version, the funny version, the version where her son had it coming. That was Polly's standing in the story while the story was still being lived. The woman just outside the frame. She had no way of knowing the frame was permanent. That the visiting brother with the fiddle had a daughter who would one day write all of this down. The knife, the harvest, the stings, the verdict, and publish it to the world. And that the same books would somehow never find room for what the next 10 years did to the woman outside the frame. Before the sale that ends this era, stay one more day on that farm, the one day the book itself chose as its opening portrait. Because the best surviving evidence of what Polly Quiner actually did with her life is hiding in plain sight in Chapter 1, all around her travelling knife. Hog-killing weather is its own season. It arrives on the first hard cold that will hold, air sharp enough to keep meat, ground not yet buried in snow. And when it arrived in the big woods, the 2 households on the quarter section stopped being 2 households at all. This is the actual content of the first chapter of Little House in the Big Woods, the most read opening in American children's literature, and almost nobody notices what they're really looking at. Uncle Henry crosses the line fence at dawn. He brings Aunt Polly's butcher knife, her knife, the family's best edge, requested in advance because this work outruns anyone kitchen's tools. The men kill and scold and scrape and hang the hog. Laura and Mary get the pig's bladder for a balloon, and the roasted tail to fight over. It reads as harvest festival coziness, and generations have taken it exactly that way. Now run the same day as labour instead of nostalgia, and watch where the work actually lands. A butchered hog is several £100 of perishable food in a world with no refrigeration, and almost every pound of it passes through the women's hands against a ticking clock. The fat has to be cut, rendered, and tried into lard over kettles that scald and spit for the better part of a day, the cracklings strained out, the lard cooled and packed away clean, because rancid lard in February is a disaster you ate in November. The head becomes head cheese, boiled, boned, seasoned, pressed. Scraps become sausage, mixed and spiced and shaped by hand, batch after batch. The hams and side meat go down into barrels under salt, layered exactly, because a sloppy salting is meat lost, and meat lost is hunger with a date on it. Then the smokehouse, and the bucket's a hollow log rigged by Ma, has to be tended for days. Green hickory smoke kept low and steady, too hot and you cook it, too cold and it spoils. That is one animal. The household processed the winter in increments like this. Game, garden, orchard scraps, the cow. Every preservation job a small exam where the failing grade was scurvy, or an empty barrel in March. The book presents the result. Attics, fat with pumpkins and braided onions. The cellar rose, the warm security that made the big woods feel like the safest place in literature. The book is honest about the work too. Ma's days are listed. Washing Monday, ironing Tuesday, churning Thursday, baking Saturday. What the book cannot say, because a 5-year-old narrator cannot know it, is that this entire economy ran in duplicate, that every kettle boiling on the South 80 had a twin boiling on the North 80, that the knife crossing the fence at dawn meant 2 kitchens were running one production line that day, and that the woman running the other half of it had more children, more mouths, and the same number of hands. Stand in the book's beloved first chapter and look north through the trees. There is the rest of it. Polly's lard kettles, Polly's salt barrels, Polly's smoke to tend, her sausage to grind, her 7 beds to keep warm under quilts. She pieced herself out of cloth she had spun. The legendary coziness of the Little House world was a manufactured product, and the books credit the family spirit and the season, never quite the 2 sisters-in-law manufacturing it, 14 and 16 hours a day in parallel for a decade. Her one documented possession is that knife. It enters American literature being borrowed for the hardest workday of the year, and it goes home with the work done. If you wanted a single object to stand for this woman's place in the national story, you could not do better, and tonight is the proof. Even her knife got into the book by being useful to somebody else's chapter. Winters like that built the legend that built the books. The legend was solvent because the machine had 2 engines. And in December 1873, Henry Quiner signed away the North 80, the farm he had bought twice, and this time there was no buying it back. What makes a man sell a farm he bought twice? In Henry Quiner's case, the answer has a date stamp. In September 1873, a Philadelphia banking house called J. Cook and Company, the firm financing half the railroads in America, collapsed without warning, and the country went down with it. They called it the Panic of 1873. Credit froze, crop prices sank. All across the upper Midwest, the smart conversation that winter was the same conversation. Timber farms were yesterday. Open prairie wheat was tomorrow. Minnesota was giving away the future in quarter sections. In December 1873, Henry sold the North 80. Within weeks, Charles and his brother Peter sold out too, and in February 1874, the Ingalls wagons crossed Lake Pepin on the ice, heading west. The Big Woods chapter of this family, both families, was over for good. But here is the divergence again, the same one Missouri exposed, now in its final form. Charles ran his road all the way to the far southwestern edge of Minnesota, to a dugout on Plum Creek outside Walnut Grove. New town, new railroad, maximum frontier. Henry and Polly stopped barely 100 miles in at Bergen Township in McLeod County. Settled country, older neighbours, churches already built, same state, opposite philosophies. And then the 1870s did to each brother-in-law exactly what you'd expect. You know Charles's version because it filled 3 books. The wheat that was going to fix everything, eaten down to the roots by grasshopper swarms that turned the sky brown. The baby boy, Freddie, born in 1875 and dead at 9 months. The charity winter working a hotel in Burr Oak, Iowa, that Laura cut from her books entirely. The long crawl back. The decade beat Charles Ingalls nearly to death, and the books alchemized every beating into adventure. The Quiners' version of the same decade is the most boring paper trail in this entire story. They farmed. Babies came, Lillian in 1874, and in 1878 the 7th and last, a girl they named Ruby. Children grew and started marrying off the farm. The records suggest Louisa was a married woman before the decade was half over. No rescue moves, no charity winters, no drama the county felt obliged to write down. I want you to sit in Polly's kitchen in Bergen Township for 1 minute, because this is the high water mark of her entire life, and the book spends 0 sentences on it. She's in her late 30s, 7 living children, count them against the odds of that century, 7 pregnancies survived, 7 infancies survived, not one small grave behind her, anywhere from Wisconsin to Missouri to Minnesota. The woman from the debt-chased family, married in a winter courtroom for the price of a fee, has produced the one thing the frontier almost never handed anyone: an unbroken family. In 1878, holding her last baby, Polly Quiner was, by every measure her world used, a fully successful woman. Whatever the Prairie's tax was, she had somehow never been billed. Keep that picture, frame it. Because every single thing you're about to watch happens to that family in the next 10 years, and when it's over you can ask yourself what the books were protecting when they kept all of it out. Hold the frame, and before the last act of this family's life begins, let me show you the same people one more way, the way the government saw them. Because the paper trail you're about to walk is very soon going to be all that's left of them, and you should see the paper while everyone in it is still alive. A census page is the least sentimental document the United States produces. No adjectives, no verdicts. A name, an age, an occupation, a tick mark. The federal government walking into your cabin once a decade, writing down who is still breathing, and riding on to the next claim. Census pages cannot tell a story, but for a family whose story got deleted, they do something better. They testify. You cannot argue with an enumerator's ink, and the ink on this family runs like a heartbeat monitor across 30 years. Watch it. 1860. Jefferson County, Wisconsin. The first count after the courtroom wedding finds a brand new household. Henry Quiner, farmer, 24. Polly, 19. And, depending on which month the enumerator rode past, a baby girl, Louisa. 3 lines of ink. A family the size of a match flame. 1870. Now the pages get interesting because this is the census that catches the machine mid-crack. In Piping County, Wisconsin, an enumerator climbs to the repurchased North 80 and counts Henry's house. Henry and Polly, mid-30s now. Louisa, 10. Charlie, 8. Albert, 5. Little Lottie, 3. Steady, rooted, growing. And that same census season, 800 miles to the southwest, a different enumerator on a horse in Montgomery County, Kansas, writes down a household squatting on the Osage Diminished Reserve. Charles Ingalls, farmer, with Caroline and 3 small girls, including a 3-year-old named Laura. That Kansas page is famous now. Collectors of Little House history treat it as the documentary bedrock of the book the whole franchise is named for. But put the 2 pages side by side, same year, same family web, half a continent apart, and you are looking at the Missouri divergence notarized. The careful brother counted at home. The restless brother counted on land he had no title to. the federal government recorded the two philosophers without knowing it. 1880, Bergen Township, McLeod County, Minnesota. The Count finds the Quiner household on its farm. Henry and Polly and the children still at home. Teenage Albert down to little Ruby, 2 years old, and even the ones counted elsewhere that year, a married daughter on some other page, were counted among the living. Every Quiner name on every list in 1880 belonged to a living person. Stop on that year, because no one knew it at the time, and it still hurts to say. This is the last time the federal government would ever take this family's picture whole. The Montana plan was already packed. The hills were 18 months out. By the next federal count in 1890, there was no intact family left to photograph. And even that 1890 census, the one that would have recorded whoever remained, no longer exists. It burned, almost all of it, in a government building fire in 1921. The official record of this family's last chapter went up, literally, in smoke. Past 1880, the state sync goes quiet and everything we know rides on private paper. Deeds, 2 letters, and stone. While we're holding the documents, notice something else about them. How loosely they hold her. Her name shifts from page to page. Polly Malona in most records, Melinda in one tree, Pauline in another. Her birth year wobbles between 1840 and 1841 depending on which clerk you trust. Paper is honest, but it is not careful. It counts. It does not care. Caring was supposed to be the storyteller's job. This family's storyteller, as we now know, had a different assignment. So that's the ledger as of 1880. One intact family, counted and certified, standing on a sold farm with a wagon pointed west. The turn had come the autumn before, and it came wearing the railroad's colours. Out in Dakota Territory, the Chicago and Northwestern was driving a line west through unbroken prairie. And the grade camps were paying the one currency the frontier never had enough of: cash money. The railroad reached into this family like a hand into a drawer. It pulled Charles first. His sister Dosha rolled up to Walnut Grove with a job offer from her contractor husband, and Charles was gone inside a week, with Caroline and the girls to follow, and it pulled the Quiners too. Because that same season, at a grading camp on the Big Sioux River, Henry Quiner showed up with Charlie and Louisa, hundreds of miles from Bergen Township, deep in Dakota, working the line. The careful man had finally smelled an opportunity worth moving for. For one last season, the old machine was about to reassemble itself on the banks of a lake called Silver. Railroad camps paid cash, and on a frontier built out of debt and barter, cash was gravity. That one fact explains everything about the autumn of 1879, why a settled 43-year-old farmer dragged his oldest son and daughter across Dakota, why Charles Ingalls jumped at a bookkeeper's desk, and why the scattered halves of the Ingalls Quiner machine, split since Missouri, suddenly snapped back together in the middle of nowhere. The camp sat first on the Big Sioux River, then moved ahead to Silver Lake, near a surveyed town site that did not exist yet called De Smet. Charles kept the company books and the company store, and one day that fall, the books preserve the moment, Caroline Ingalls looked up from her work and found her own brother standing in front of her. "Henry!" Ma exclaimed. "It's a surprise, Caroline," Pa sang out. "I thought I wouldn't tell you Henry's out here." "I declare," said May, "it takes my breath. I'm so surprised." That little exchange, sitting quietly in Chapter 7 of By the Shores of Silver Lake, is the last warm scene this extended family would ever get, in literature or in life. Uncle Henry was out there working the grade. With him came the cousins, Louisa, 19, cooking for crews at the boarding shanty, and Charlie, 17 now, broad-shouldered, handling teams. Think about what Laura, age 12, was looking at. The last version of Charlie fixed in the family canon was the wrapped, swollen boy in the bed, the punchline of Pa's harvest story. The Charlie in front of her at Silver Lake was a grown young man doing grown men's work in a camp full of rough crews, earning real wages. Whatever the family fable said he was, the person standing at the cook shanty was nobody's cautionary tale. He was the kind of son a mother writes proud letters about. Polly wasn't at the camp. She was back in McLeod County with the younger children, holding the farm while her husband and her 2 oldest converted a season of Dakota labour into a stake. because that's what this was, and the book says so straight out, the Quiners had a plan. When the season ended, the book tells us, Uncle Henry and Charlie and Louisa were going back to sell the farm, and in the spring the whole family was going west to Montana Territory. Small correction from the record, and it matters more than it looks. The book says they went back to the Big Woods to sell. The Big Woods farm had been gone for 6 years by then, sold in December 1873. The actual farm was in Bergen Township, Minnesota. Laura was writing this scene 60 years after it happened, and the geography of her aunt's family had gone soft in her memory. Soft in a particular direction. In Laura's books, the Quiners belong permanently to the Big Woods, to Chapter 1, to the deep past of childhood. Even while she was writing them a future, she was filing them in the past. But mark what the plan actually was, because this is Henry Quiner, the man who turned around in Missouri, the man who bought his own farm back rather than gamble, the most risk-averse adult in this entire saga, announcing a move to Montana Territory. The careful man had finally caught the family disease. One good cash season on the railroad, 1 decade of watching wheat farmers get rich while timber farmers held steady, and the boy from the funeral year decided at last at 44 to take his one big swing. The camp broke up as winter came down. The Quiners loaded their wagon for Minnesota, and somewhere on the shore of Silver Lake in the late fall of 1879, this family said goodbye to itself. Nobody in that scene knew it was the last one. They never do. Laura would write about Charlie and Louisa and Uncle Henry, riding off with the easy confidence of a girl who assumed the web of aunts and uncles and double cousins was a permanent feature of the universe. That family, like the Prairie, was simply always there. There's a detail in how Laura staged that goodbye, decades later, that deserves 30 seconds here, because it is the most delicate piece of craftsmanship in this whole erasure. The chapter of By the Shores of Silver Lake, in which the Quiners announce their leaving, is called Wings Over Silver Lake. It is a chapter about migration, the autumn sky filling with wild birds, geese and swans and ducks, pouring south ahead of the freeze while Laura watches from the shore. Into that chapter, amid all that beautiful leaving, Laura set her uncle's family and their Montana plans. Cousins and waterfowl lifting off together, everything headed somewhere better, in a passage built out of pure wonder. It may be the loveliest staging in the series, and once you know where the Quiner wagon was actually pointed, it reads like a magician's hand. The eye follows the birds, and the family vanishes under the feathers. Migration, the heart whispers, is round trip. The birds come back in spring. The chapter is counting on you to feel that. Polly herself is off stage even here, back in Minnesota, packing up the house she would never see again. Her part in the Great Migration chapter is to be a name in somebody else's travel plans, outside the frame, one more time, at her own family's farewell. And the winters that followed sealed the two families' directions for good. The Ingalls passed that first Dakota winter, the Quiners freshly gone, alone and almost cosy in the surveyor's house by the lake, the best provisioned winter they would ever spend in the territory. The winter after that, the hard winter of 1880 and 81, nearly starved the whole town of De Smet around them, and the books wrung a full volume of triumph out of the surviving. Whatever those same winters did to a tin camp 300 miles west, no book was ever assigned to find out. The De Smet winter became literature because it had survivors to interview. The Harney winters became nothing, because by the time anyone thought to ask, there was no one left in the gulch to answer. No surviving record puts Laura and Charlie in the same room again. And the place the Quiners were actually headed, not the Montana of the plan, but where the road really took them, was a wall of dark pine mountains rising off the Dakota plains. Ground the Lakota held sacred, and the United States had promised them by treaty, in writing, forever. Ground the army had then taken back at gunpoint 7 years before the Quiner wagon rolled toward it, because of what was buried in the creek beds. The Black Hills, where the gold was almost gone, and something worse than gold was waiting. A grey rock that was about to tell the whole region a lie. There is a rock in this story, grey, heavy for its size, dull until you turn it in the light. Hold on to it. It arrives in a few minutes, and when it does, it kills more of this family than the frontier, the lake, and the war combined. First, the ground itself. Because you cannot tell the truth about where Polly Quiner is buried without telling the truth about whose ground it was. In 1868, at Fort Laramie, the United States signed a treaty that drew the Great Sioux Reservation onto the map and put the Black Hills inside it. Lakota land by American law, with white settlement barred. The ink was 6 years old when the Army sent George Armstrong Custer through the hills with 1,000 men and a pair of prospectors, and the prospectors found what prospectors always find. The word went down the telegraph wires in the summer of 1874. Gold, from the grassroots down, on French Creek. What happened next tells you everything about how the West actually worked. The miners came illegally, that's not an opinion, that's the treaty, and the Army was ordered to throw them out. Within months of Custer's announcement, there were thousands inside the hills. The government did the arithmetic on evicting its own voters at bayonet point, and you can guess which way the arithmetic ran. But the first winter set the pattern. In December 1874, a party of 20-odd civilians out of Sioux City slipped past the patrols, threw up a log stockade on French Creek, and squatted in open defiance through the worst months of a Dakota winter. Short rations, brutal cold, and every morning the chance of soldiers or Lakota riders on the ridgeline. The cavalry finally reached them in the spring of 1875 and marched them out under escort, leaving the stockade to the weather. And inside that stockade, among the very first trespassers in the Black Hills, was a man named Thomas Quiner, Carolyn's brother, Henry's brother, Polly's brother-in-law twice over. Laura knew the story. Decades later, she sat Uncle Tom down in one of her books and let him tell it by the De Smet fire, the stockade, the soldiers, all of it. The Quiner family didn't drift into the Black Hills by accident. They had a man inside the gold rush from its first illegal week. By 1877, the question of ownership was settled the way it was always going to be settled. The Great Sioux War had come and gone. Custer was dead at the Little Bighorn, and Congress answered him by seizing the hills outright, attaching the cession to the Lakota's food rations, sign or starve. A century later, the Supreme Court of the United States would look back at that transaction and order compensation for what it called a taking, money the Lakota have refused to touch, sitting in an account, growing to this day. That is the ground this chapter stands on. Everything that follows happens on land the law itself eventually called stolen. The southern hills had their own small rush. Placer gold turned up on Battle Creek in 1875, and a camp called Harney City sprouted in the gulch. A few hundred miners, tents going to cabins, the usual arithmetic. The big bonanza went north to Deadwood. Harney stayed small, scratching colour out of the creek until the easy gold thinned. Then came the rock. In 1883, on a hillside above Battle Creek, a man named Ferguson opened a mine he called the Etta, working it for mica. Out of that hole came chunks of a grey, heavy mineral nobody could place, and a sample went out for assay. The word that came back lit the southern hills on fire. Cassiterite. Tin ore. You have to understand what tin meant in 1883 to feel the heat of this. The United States ran on tin, every can of food, every roof, every pot of solder, and produced almost none of it. The entire national supply sailed in from Cornwall and the East Indies. A domestic tin field would mint millionaires and headlines, and the promoters knew it. A corporation formed, the Harney Peak Tin Mining, Milling and Manufacturing Company, and started swallowing the district whole, buying the Etta and in time more than 1,000 claims around it. A mill and smelter went up in 1883. Camps thickened along the creek. Etta Camp, with the only post office for miles, and Harney City below it. Money was pouring in. Wages were real. The future, the promoters said, was under everyone's boots. Into this, sometime between the spring of 1880 and those tin fever years, rolled the Quiner wagon. The plan announced at Silver Lake had said Montana, and the researcher who knows this family best allows that they may have tried Montana for a while. But where the paper trail finds them again is Harney City, Pennington County, Dakota Territory, in the shadow of the Etta mine. Henry pushing 50, Polly in her early 40s, 6 children still with them, Charlie and Albert grown men now, Lottie a young woman, George and Lillian half grown, Ruby a little girl. What does a farm family do in a mining camp? The record doesn't itemise their work, but the skills they carried tell you the shape of it. There was money in hauling, in timber for the mine works, in milk and eggs and garden truck. A camp eats everything and grows nothing. And remember what Henry, Charlie and Louisa had spent 1879 doing on the railroad. Boarding workers. Feeding single men by the dozen for cash. A tin camp was wall-to-wall single men. However the Quiners assembled their living, it was the old family trade, converting Polly's kind of work, the invisible kind, into income. But mining camps have a trap built into their floor, and the Quiners walked straight onto it. Everything in a camp costs double or triple. Every sack of flour freighted up a mountain road carries the road in its price. Wages look fat until you spend them. Families arrived with a stake, planning 2 good years and out. The camp ate the stake quietly, month by month, and one morning they woke up unable to afford the wagon ride back to the world. I'm not guessing about that trap. Polly's going to describe it to you herself in her own handwriting in about 5 minutes. And here is the stake I want planted before we cross into the worst chapter of this story. For the first time in her entire life, Wisconsin, Missouri, Minnesota. Polly Quiner had no family within reach, no mother across the river, no sister-in-law over the fence line. Caroline and Charles were 330 miles east in De Smet, 2 to 3 weeks by wagon, a different world. 7 Quiners, 1 gulch, and around them nothing but strangers, pines, and promoters. If anything went wrong now, there was no one to shout for. In the autumn of 1884, something went wrong. It did not care about tin, and it did not come for the miners. It came for the children. In the town record books of colonial New England, under the years 1735 and 1736, there is a phrase that stops historians cold: the throat distemper. It came through the villages of New Hampshire and Massachusetts like weather. In the hardest-hit towns, it took 1/3 of the children. There are burial grounds in that country where a single family's stone carries 4 and 5 names cut in one season. The dates packed shoulder to shoulder inside a few weeks. Parents of that generation wrote about it the way soldiers write about artillery. It fell where it fell, and nothing you did mattered. A century later, a French physician studying the grey full skin it grew in children's throats gave the killer its modern name, from the Greek word for leather, diphtheria. The hide disease, and folk memory, which is usually more accurate than medicine was, gave it a better name still, the strangling angel of children. Here is what it actually did, because you need this chapter to understand the next one. It starts like nothing: a sore throat, a low fever, a child quiet at supper, off her food. Any mother of 7 had seen that 100 times and cured it with rest and broth, 99 of them. Then, on the 2nd or 3rd day, you look into the throat and see the thing every 19th century parent prayed never to see. A grey-white membrane, tough as wet leather, creeping across the tonsils and down, a full skin the body cannot shed, sealing the airway like a hand closing slowly from the inside. The neck swells until the old doctors called it bull neck. And the disease has a signature, a detail you should file away. It takes the voice early. Hoarseness, then a whisper, then nothing. It gags its victims before it kills them. A child in the late stage of diphtheria cannot cry out for her mother. The end, when it comes by suffocation, over hours, sometimes days, while the family watches and the lungs fight for a throat that no longer exists. And for the ones who fought through it, this is the cruelty the textbooks underline. The angel kept a second blade. The bacteria pump out a toxin that travels the bloodstream and quietly eats at the heart muscle and the nerves. Survivors who had been walking, eating, recovering for 2 and 3 weeks would stand up one morning and drop dead. Heart failure, delivered on a delay. In a bad strain, recovered meant nothing until a month had passed. It travelled in breath and on lips, coughs, kisses, the shared dipper at the water pail, the shared cup, sometimes the milk. which means it was purpose-built for the architecture of the American frontier. One-room cabins where 6 people shared one air supply all winter, one-room schools where every child in a district met daily, and work camps, crowded, transient, sanitation-free, where strangers' children played together at the edge of the diggings. When diphtheria came through a settlement like that, it did not visit. It harvested. Now ask what a doctor could do about any of this in 1884, assuming a mining gulch in the Black Hills had a doctor at all, which is assuming a great deal. The honest answer? Almost nothing. The remedy books of the day prescribed steam tents and sulphur fumes, lime water, swabbing the throat with caustics, treatments that exhausted the child and touched the disease not at all. The desperate last resort was a tracheotomy, opening the windpipe below the blockage with whatever blade was available, by lamplight, usually too late. Beyond that, medicine's entire arsenal was a quarantine sign nailed to the door. Food left at a distance by neighbours who would come no closer. And in district after district, one more rule that tells you everything about how feared this disease was. No public funerals for its dead. Infectious bodies went into the ground fast in small private burials unattended. Grief itself was quarantined. Now the detail that makes this chapter genuinely hard to forgive. The cure was almost in sight. In a Berlin laboratory, even as the 1880s closed, researchers were turning horse serum into the diphtheria antitoxin. Emil von Behring would win the first Nobel Prize in medicine ever awarded for it. By the mid-1890s, vials of the stuff were shipping to drugstores and railway depots across America, and within a generation the Strangling Angel was demoted from mass killer of children to a manageable emergency. The antitoxin missed the Quiner cabin by about 10 years. Whether diphtheria is certainly what entered that cabin, the next chapter will weigh as honestly as the record allows. What is documented is this. The Black Hills had their epidemic that season. The researcher who reconstructed this family's last years notes the disease raging through the district at exactly the right time, and Harney City was built out of everything the Angel loved. Crowded cabins, shared water, a school's worth of children in a gulch with no board of health, no quarantine officer, and the nearest real help a mountain road away. That is the machine that came up Battle Creek with the freight in the fall of 1884. The month is starting. Go back inside the cabin, set the calendar for the autumn of 1884, and watch 2 letters cross the country in opposite directions. On September the 20th, 1884, back in Jefferson County, Wisconsin, in the settled, safe, church-going country the Quiners had left behind, Charlotte Quiner Holbrook died at 75. Grandma, the widow from the Lake story, the woman who had held 6 fatherless children together through the starving years, the matriarch this whole double family had grown from. Her death was long expected. She had been failing for some time. Her daughter Martha sat down and wrote the news west, to a sister-in-law in a mining camp in the Black Hills, to Polly. That letter crawled toward Harney City through October and into November, by rail and stage and mountain freight road. And while it travelled, in the gulch it was travelling toward, Polly Quiner's children began to die. The record of what happened in that camp in those weeks comes down to a single page, and the page does not give dates, and it does not give names, and it does not say which child went first. What it says, and researchers matching the letter against the family's records identify the 3, is that in less than 1 month, in the fall of 1884, Polly and Henry lost Charlie, George, and Lillian. The diphtheria epidemic burning through the district at exactly that time is the likeliest killer. The family's own letter never names the disease, and after 140 years, no one can swear to it. What no one disputes is the count and the clock. Charles Henry Quiner, 22 years old, a grown man, and that detail alone tells you how savage this outbreak was, because diphtheria preferred children, and a strain that could strangle a 22-year-old teamster was a strain with almost no survivors at the small end of the cabin. George Lansford Quiner, 13, the boy born on the repurchased farm in the Goodyears, named for both grandfathers' houses. Lillian Quiner, 10, born in the first Minnesota spring, the child of the quiet decade. 3 beds, 1 cabin, 16 feet of pine plank if it was generous, in a camp with no church bell and no family within 300 miles. 1 month. Try to hold what the arithmetic of that month actually means inside a single household. Quarantine was the camp's only weapon, meaning that whatever happened inside that cabin, the neighbours' help stopped at the door. And if the district followed the rules every epidemic district followed, there were no gatherings for these deaths, no church service. Harney had no church to hold one, no procession, a wagon, a box, the family's own shovels. The hills start going to frost in October. Every grave after the first came harder. No printed word marks any of it either. If a camp paper ever set those 3 names in type, no copy has ever been found. Just Henry and Albert digging on the hillside above the creek, then digging again, then again. And Polly inside doing the one thing she had trained for her whole life and finding it useless. 13 years earlier, in a Wisconsin harvest kitchen, she had packed her swollen boy in cool earthen cloth strips and counted his breaths till morning, and the remedy had held. The boy had come back. That night turned out to be the rehearsal. This time she packed nothing, because there was nothing. You cannot poultice a closing throat. The fable, you'll remember, gave Charlie 4 screams in that oat field. Diphtheria gives none. It takes the voice first. Somewhere in the middle of that month, Martha's letter from Wisconsin finally came up the freight road and into the cabin, the first mail to reach them in who knows how long. Polly opened it and read that her mother-in-law, the woman who had been a second mother to her since she was 12 years old on the Oconomowoc, was dead too. Grandma, gone in Wisconsin. 3 children, gone in the Gulch, all in one autumn. On November 27th, 1884, the day before Thanksgiving as the states reckoned it, Polly Ingalls Quiner cleared a space, found paper and ink and sat down to answer her sister-in-law. That answer survives. It is the only window into this family's catastrophe that exists anywhere on Earth. A single page that historians of the Little House world handle like a relic. It's time you heard what the books never let you hear. Aunt Polly in her own voice. Harney City, Pennington County, Dakota Territory, November 27, 1884. Dear sister, forgive us for not writing sooner. Your letter was the first to reach us, and sad news it was. We had been talking a great deal and talking about dear mother. Her death was not unexpected, but it was hard to bear to think we never can see her again. That filled us with grief, believe me. Dear sister, I think that we can truly sympathise with you. We saw our own dear children fade and die, 3 of them in less than 1 short month. Oh, it is hard to bear, but we must be resigned and hope to meet them where parting is no more. That is Polly, the only extended passage of her voice that survives anywhere. 1 page out of a life of 48 years. Read it fast and it sounds like standard Victorian condolence. Read it slowly, clause by clause, and it will take the air out of the room. Start with the first line. Forgive us for not writing sooner. A woman is apologising for her correspondence habits. In the same autumn, she buried 3 children. That little apology is the whole 19th century female code in 7 words. Composure as duty, manners as armour, your own catastrophe held politely behind your back while you greet the visitor at the door. Your letter was the first to reach us. 6 words of pure geography. Mail barely found these people. Whatever else was sent west that year, birthday letters, news, the ordinary chatter of a big family, it had not made it up the freight road. The Quiners' isolation isn't a guess. It's right there, stated as a fact of life, by the person living it. Then watch the order of operations, because this is the detail historians of this family return to. The dead children do not come first. Martha's grief comes first. Polly works through her mother-in-law's death. Hard to bear to think we never can see her again. And offers comfort to the woman in Wisconsin before she permits her own disaster onto the page. And when it finally comes, look at the doorway it enters through. I think that we can truly sympathise with you. Sympathy. Her 3 graves appear in this letter as a credential. Proof that her condolences for a 75-year-old's expected death are sincere. She is consoling someone else with the worst thing that ever happened to her. We saw our own dear children fade and die. Saw. Fade. This was not sudden, and she was present for all of it. Fade is a word from a woman who sat through the full duration, who watched 3 separate times as a child went from sick to quiet to silent. Whatever the disease was, this clause rules out mercy. We must be resigned. If you've read enough letters from this century, you know that word is doing structural work. Resignation was the official posture of Christian grief, the duty to accept what God allowed on pain of blasphemy. It is also, if you listen, a command being issued by a woman to herself in writing, because the alternative to resignation in a one-room cabin with 4 remaining children was not survivable, and then the only future she allows herself, hope to meet them where parting is no more. 5 years earlier, this family stood on the shore of Silver Lake and said goodbye to the Ingalls side, assuming reunions were a renewable resource. Now Polly relocates every reunion she has left to heaven, where parting is no more, from the woman whose entire biography, Wisconsin to Missouri to Minnesota to the hills, was partings. The letter carries 2 more pieces of intelligence, and they aim this story at its ending like a rifle. The family, Polly reports, is trying to earn enough money to go back east. Read that against the chapter you just heard. The trap had closed. The West was over for the Quiners. The plan now, the only plan, was reverse. The family that had chased the frontier for 30 years wanted exactly one thing. Out. They could not afford out. And the second piece, 6 words long, the fuse for everything that remains. Henry, she writes, is not well. One more thing about this page before we leave it. About the fact that you just heard it at all. The letter survives because the Wisconsin relatives kept everything. 91 pages of this family's correspondence, spanning 1861 to 1910, sit today in the Wisconsin Historical Society, scanned and public since 2009. Polly Quiner has no surviving photograph that researchers can point to with certainty, no memoir, no interview, and, as you'll hear before we're done, not even a gravestone anymore. Her handwriting is the entire estate, and the estate exists because of one more woman the books never met, Martha. Henry's sister, the dear sister on the envelope, was this family's keeper. While households scattered across 5 states and the frontier chewed through paper the way it chewed through everything else, Martha Quiner Carpenter kept the letters, decades of them. Hers is the reason a mining camp widow's voice outlived the mining camp, a farm wife in Wisconsin deciding year after year that her family's words were worth saving. The pages came down through her line until they reached the State Historical Society, where they were catalogued imperfectly, researchers note, with several writers and dates misattributed until specialists pushed corrections, and finally in 2009 scanned and put online, where anyone on Earth can now read Polly's November page at 2 a.m. More than one researcher of this family has admitted to doing exactly that. Now set that one fragile survival next to the other side of the family, and look hard at the infrastructure of memory, because remembering, it turns out, is not a feeling. It is a system, and it has budgets. Laura's side of the web has museums and home sites strung across the map. Pepin, Walnut Grove, Burr Oak, De Smet, Mansfield, shrines with parking lots and gift shops and guest books. Her manuscripts rest in climate-controlled archives. Her handwriting sits under glass in 2 states. An industry of scholars, pilgrims, and bonneted reenactors tends every scrap she ever touched. Polly's side of the same web has 1 page in Madison that survived because a sister-in-law refused to throw anything away, a grave marker in a museum case, and a hillside that cannot hold on to its stones. Same family, same century, same blood, twice over. The difference between immortality and erasure was never about who mattered more. It was about who got a storyteller, and whose ending fit the story America wanted on the nightstand. A woman's whole testimony, 1 page, holding the line politely between dear sister and the abyss. She signed it, sealed it, and sent it down the mountain the day before Thanksgiving 1884, hoping to meet where parting is no more. The partings were not done with her. Who was Polly Quiner? Not the aunt with the knife, not the row in the census. the woman. Be honest about the problem first, because honesty is the whole point of this channel. History did not leave us her interior. No diary, no interview, no memoir. One page of her sentences written under the worst circumstances of her life, in a voice trained to give nothing away. Everything beyond that page is inference, and I'll flag it as inference. But inference from a record is not guessing. People tell you who they are by what they do every time the road forks. Polly's road forked over and over for 48 years, and she answered the same way every single time. Look at the pattern with me. At 18, with the whole frontier supposedly full of possibility, she married the boy from across the river, not a stranger with prospects, but the most known quantity in her world, a young man she had watched be steady since she was 12 years old. When the family enterprise hit Missouri, and the road forked between adventure and home, her household turned around and bought its own farm back. When the third fork came in Minnesota, her family planted itself in settled country and stayed put for 7 years, while her brother chased horizons through 3 disasters. Marriage to the careful man, the reversal, the buyback, the quiet decade. Every documented decision this woman's household ever made bent in the same direction, toward known ground, toward kin within reach, toward the cluster. That is not timidity. Look at where she came from and call it what it was: engineering. Polly was raised inside a family that debt chased across 3 states. She married into a family that one storm on one lake had cut in half. Both she and Henry were children of the same lesson, that catastrophe arrives uninvited, sideways, and once, and the household they built together reads like a machine designed against exactly that lesson. Stay near family, duplicate everything across a fence line, save, hold. The 3 marriages of 1859 to 1861 were the same engineering at family scale. Insurance made out of people. If disaster comes for one house, the web catches it. The web worked for 25 years. Hold that thought, because the cruelty at the centre of this story lives right there. The one time in her entire life that Polly's household took a real risk. One move, at the urging of a tin promise, after a lifetime of declining every gamble her brother ever took. The catastrophe her whole design existed to prevent walked up the gulch and took almost everyone. The family built against loss lost the most. Charles, the man who gambled annually, who squatted on treaty land and dodged rent and crossed thin ice with his children in the wagon. Charles died in his bed in town decades later with his daughters around him. There is no moral in that. That is the point. The frontier did not distinguish the careful from the reckless, and the books that taught America otherwise were written by the reckless man's daughter. Now the interior, the closest the record lets us get to it. 2 phrases in her letter are load-bearing. We must be resigned, and hope to meet them where parting is no more. That is not stock piety pasted onto grief. For a woman of Polly's time and church, it was the actual operating system. Resignation was a discipline, the daily, deliberate refusal to accuse God of what the hills had done. And it offered the one thing a quarantined cabin could not: a container, somewhere to put it. The cost of that container is in the same sentences if you listen. A woman forbidden to rage does her raging nowhere. If Polly ever screamed at the pines above Battle Creek, the pines kept it. The page America inherited is calm because calm was the assignment, and she had been doing assignments since the Oconomowoc. And what did she want? Here the record is suddenly painfully direct, because she wrote it down. The only want of Polly Quiner's that survives on paper, the last documented desire of her life, was to go back east. East meant backward. East meant Wisconsin, the river, the relatives, the burying grounds with her people already in them, the world before the gamble. The great westering saga of her family ends, on her side of it, with a woman in a dying camp saving coins toward a wagon ride in the wrong direction and not getting it. She wanted out of the West, and the West kept her. She's buried deeper inside it than the brother who actually loved the thing. Keep this woman, the engineer, the believer, the one who wanted to go home, standing in front of you now, because the record is about to do what it did to her family, it resumes the count, with the youngest. Ruby Quiner was 7 years old in 1885. She was the baby, born in Bergen Township in 1878, the 7th child, the one in Polly's arms in that picture I asked you to frame, the high water mark, the unbroken family. She'd been 4 or 5 when the wagon came up into the hills, young enough that the gulch was the only home she really knew. The other children carried Wisconsin and Minnesota inside them. Ruby's whole world was pine slopes, mine whistles, and a one-room cabin that, by her 6th birthday, had 3 empty beds in it. The record gives Ruby one fact and nothing else. She died in 1885. No month, no cause. The epidemic year was over. Maybe it was a last ember of the same disease, maybe fever, maybe any of the dozen things that took frontier children quietly. 1 year after losing 3 children in a month, Polly and Henry carried their youngest up the same hillside and laid her with her brothers and her sister, 4 of 7. Let that number stand a second, and while the family was being subtracted, so was the camp's entire reason to exist, because the rock was coming up empty. The Etter's tin was real mineral, but 2 years of mill runs could not pull it out in paying quantity. The seams that assayed rich in samples thinned to nothing in the stopes. In 1886, the Etter mine shut down, a failure. The company would stagger on for years on promotion and English capital, over 1,000 claims, glittering prospectuses, a scandal whose collapse made international news in the early 1890s, remembered in mining history as the Great Black Hills Tin Fiasco. But for the Gulch settlements, 1886 was the verdict. The work dried up precisely when the Quiners were saving their way toward an exit. The rock had lied. Everyone in the Gulch had paid something for believing it. The Quiners had paid 4 children, one bitter footnote for the record's sake. Years later, the Etter finally did pay, not in tin but in spodumene, a lithium ore the old miners had been tossing on the waste piles. The largest crystal of it ever recorded came out of that hill, and for a stretch the Etter was the most productive spodumene mine in the country. The ground had value after all, just not in time, and not for the people it buried. Henry went next. The record says he had not been well since at least the month of the letter, 2 years of it, whatever it was. In 1886, the same year his mine, his camp, and his last reason for the whole gamble closed down around him, Henry Oden Quiner died at 50, the 9-year-old from the funeral year, the boy who ploughed at Collarbone Heights so his widowed mother could keep the family whole, the man who turned around in Missouri, who repurchased his own farm rather than risk strange ground, who held the careful line for half a century and broke it exactly once. One swing, at 44, on a tin promise. He was buried on the hillside with his children. His grave got a proper headstone. Hold on to that stone. It has one more journey to make before this video ends. Now do the arithmetic on the household. Of the 9 Quiners alive at the start of 1884, 5 were gone by the end of 1886. What remained in Harney City was Polly, in her mid-40s, with Albert, a young man of 22, and Lottie, 19, plus Louisa, married and gone west years before. How they lived, the record doesn't say. A widow in a dying camp, a son old enough for wages wherever the hills still paid any, whatever boarding or washing or sewing a settlement on its way to ghost town status could still support. The trail here is almost silent. It speaks exactly once more, and what it says is about a purchase. At some point in these stripped bare years, the family bought a monument, a real cut-stone family marker for the graves on the hillside with small initialed footstones for each of the dead. Sit with what that means. People who could not afford the wagon ride east bought stone. The last disposable dollars this family had went into the one asset that was supposed to be permanent, being remembered. Polly lasted 2 more years. She died on November 28th, and even her death year wobbles in the records. 1887 in one account, 1888 in the letter trail the researchers trust most. When a woman's own death year has a margin of error, you're not looking at a mystery. You're looking at a measurement of exactly how far outside the recorded world she had fallen. Late November, at any rate, almost 4 years to the day after the letter. 47 or 48 years old. Her son Albert wrote the news east to Wisconsin, the same direction Polly had written hers, and his letter survives the same way. Poor mother is dead. We put her to rest beside Pa and little Ruby. We have a nice monument at their graves. No cause is given. After the 4 years you've just watched, you don't need one. 29 years, almost to the season, from the Justice Court in Concord to the hillside above Battle Creek. Of the 7 children Polly Quiner raised past infancy, through the big woods, Missouri, the quiet decade, all of it without a single loss. 4 were in the ground before her, with her husband beside them, in a cemetery on land the law itself would one day call stolen, outside a camp built on a rock that lied, and each of those subtractions rode east as a letter, 330 miles, into the mailbox of a family whose daughter was about to become the most famous chronicler of family in American history. Before we open her books, you need to see the 2 calendars side by side, because they fit together like an indictment. 2 towns, 1 bloodline, 4 years. Watch them in parallel. First, be clear about the wiring, so nobody can wave this away later. Caroline Ingalls was Henry Quiner's little sister. The dead children were her nephews and nieces twice over, her brother's children by her husband's sister. The Wisconsin relatives who kept Polly's letters were the same Carpenter and Quiner kin who wrote to De Smet. This was one mail network, and the Ingalls house sat squarely on it. There is no version of these years in which the news skips Laura's family. Laura was 17, living at home, when the first wave landed. Now, run the calendars. Autumn, 1884, Harney City. 3 children fade and die in less than 1 short month. Autumn, 1884, De Smet. Laura Ingalls is being courted. This is the exact season of the famous cutter rides, Almanzo Wilder's horses dashing across the prairie, the sleigh bells, the courtship that these happy golden years would one day spin into one of the most beloved romances in children's literature. The buggy rides and the burials are the same months, the same family, 1 letter apart. 1885, Harney City, little Ruby dies, age 7. 1885, De Smet. On August 25th, in a quiet ceremony, Laura marries Almanzo. A bride at 18, a new house on a tree claim, the future opening up. Aunt Polly, in the same calendar year, closes the grave of her lastborn. 1886, Harney City. The Etta closes. Henry Quiner dies at 50. Polly is a widow in a camp with no work left in it. December 1886, De Smet. Laura's daughter Rose is born. One side of the family web is producing its next generation. The other side is being deleted in place. Then the calendars converge. And this is the part that should make you sit very still. In the spring of 1888, on their Dakota claim, Laura and Almanzo both came down with diphtheria. The same strangling disease, the likeliest killer of her cousins, in her own house, in her own throat. Laura survived it clean. Almanzo got out of bed too soon, took what the family called a stroke, and dragged a partly lamed body through the rest of his long life. Laura learned that disease the way Polly had, by nursing it, fearing it, watching what it leaves behind. And that November 28th, 1888, by the letter trail, Aunt Polly died in the hills. The news rode east one last time, into the house of a niece who now knew precisely, personally, clinically, what her aunt's family had been through in the cabin at Harney City. Here's the thing you have to hold on to about Laura's next few years, because it bears directly on everything the books became. Her own life now went into the fire. In the summer of 1889, her infant son died, days old and unnamed. Weeks later, her house burned to the ground. Drought took the crops, debt took the rest. The young couple from the storybook romance crawled out of Dakota years later, with their health broken and almost nothing else. And decades on, when Laura sat down to write, she put those years on paper too. A thin, flinching manuscript about her first 4 years of marriage. The dead son and the fire and the debt all in it. Then she put it away. It stayed unpublished as long as she lived. The world only read it after she was dead. Mark that, because it's the fairest thing anyone can say in her defence, and the most damning. Laura Ingalls. Wilder could not publish Catastrophe. Not her aunt's, not even her own. The West that won, the West that simply beat a family into the ground and kept the ground, was a story her shelf of books had no slot for, whether the family in question was Polly's or hers. So when people ask what Laura did with her aunt's story, the honest answer needs all of this context first. Because what she did was nothing. And the nothing took work. Some erasures are accidents. This one had drafts. You've just watched the two calendars run side by side, so the first fact is already on the table. Beyond argument. Laura knew. Every wave of it in real time through the family mail, and the final wave reached her in the very year the disease itself had been inside her own house. The question was never whether she knew. The question is what she did with the knowing, and the record of that is her shelf of books. Walk it with me. In 1919, in her Missouri Farm column, she resurrects Charlie, 35 years dead, as the boy who lied to score a point about the Kaiser's Germany. That's the proof of memory. Half a century on, the cousins are alive in her head, on tap, vivid enough to publish, as a parable. In 1930, at 63, she writes Pioneer Girl, her autobiography, the no-fiction version, the manuscript meant to set down what actually happened to her family. The Quiner catastrophe is not in it. And hold that manuscript in mind, because its afterlife proves the point. When Pioneer Girl finally reached print in 2014 and became a surprise national bestseller, it took the editor's footnotes, the scholarship bolted onto her pages by researchers, 84 years on, to begin putting the missing Quiners back into the record. Her own text never does it. In 1932, Little House in the Big Woods fixes the family in amber, Uncle Henry at the butchering, Aunt Polly's knife, Charlie and the yellow jackets, served the little liar right. The most enduring portrait of Polly's family ever made, drawn from the years when it was whole. In 1939, By the Shores of Silver Lake stages the reunion at the railroad camp and sends the Quiners off toward Montana with the spring. Laura wrote those chapters a full 50 years after Polly died. She knew, as her pen moved, where that wagon was actually going. That Montana meant a tin camp, an epidemic, and a hillside of initialed stones. She wrote them riding west into hope, and stopped the camera at the property line. And in 1943, in these happy golden years, she allows the family exactly one more appearance. Second-hand news delivered by Uncle Tom by the fire. The Quiners are out in the Black Hills. Louisa has married and gone. In book time, that scene sits in the early spring of 1884. Months later, in the real calendar, the dying started. The series ends, the curtain comes down, and the last word the Little House universe ever speaks about this family is, in effect, still out there, doing fine. 8 novels, 1 memoir, not one Quiner death, anywhere, ever. And one more quiet fact, the kind that looks small until you try to work around it. The books never print the family's surname. Uncle Henry, Aunt Polly, Cousin Charlie. First names only, family talk. Whether that was craft or simply the way you write about kin, the effect is identical. For 90 years, a reader who wanted to follow the aunt out of Chapter 1 had no name to search, no thread to pull. The books didn't just leave the story untold, they left it unfindable. Now, why? You're owed more than outrage here, so let's hold up every honest answer at once. The gentle answer first, because it's real. These were children's books, told strictly through a child's eyes, and after the age of 12, Laura never saw the Quiners again. Their catastrophe happened 300 miles off her stage. A writer shaping her own childhood for 8-year-olds does not owe the reader an obituary column for every branch of the family tree. Laura also cut her own dead. You'll hear the full list in a few minutes. And her instinct with death was consistent. Shelter the reader. Polly's story was unshelterable. But then there's the harder answer, and it has a co-author. The books were built in the 1930s, in the pit of the Depression, by Laura and her daughter Rose Wilder Lane, a professional writer with a fierce, explicit ideology of self-reliance, who shaped and sharpened the manuscripts draft by draft. Under their hands, the series became an argument that grit, family and freedom from dependence on anyone would carry Americans through anything. Because look, it carried us. That argument needed the frontier to be hard, and it needed the hard frontier to be survivable by virtue, and the Quiners break the argument. That's the cold centre of this whole video, so let me say it precisely. Henry and Polly were the control group, the careful ones, no debts, no charity winters, no reckless squatting on treaty land. The family that did everything the thesis prescribes, and the West subtracted 5 of its 9 members in 4 years, stranded the rest, and could not even hold on to their gravestones. Put that household next to the Ingalls story and the moral of the series stops being self-evident. The books say, the frontier tests families and the worthy pass. Polly's ledger says, it was a lottery, and my children held losing tickets while my brothers held winners, and we were more careful than they were. You cannot print both and keep the music. One of them had to go, and the one that went is buried above Battle Creek. Was it conscious? No document says so. No letter where Laura or Rose weighs the Quiners and cuts them. Fairness requires you hear that plainly. What the documents do show is the pattern. Every hopeful scene kept, every grave omitted, the surname withheld. The camera turned away at the exact moment the proof would have come on stage. Choices repeated across 5 books and 20 years. At some point, a pattern that consistent stops needing a memo. The aunt who was left dying in the Black Hills and never written about again. Now you know that the title of this video is not a figure of speech. It is a publication history. Still, maybe you're holding on to the gentle answer and you should test it. One trimmed branch could be coincidence. So before we leave Laura's desk, run the full audit with me. Because Polly was not the only cut, and the complete list is a fingerprint. Put all 8 novels on the table, set the family's real paper trail beside them, and mark every difference. A pattern comes up, and it sorts with almost mechanical neatness. Start with the deletions. Freddie. Charles Frederick Ingalls, Laura's little brother, the only Ingalls son, was born at Walnut Grove on November 1st, 1875. The next summer, as the defeated family rolled east away from the grasshopper country, the baby sickened and was carried into a familiar refuge, the farm of Uncle Peter Ingalls, Polly's brother, the third corner of the triple marriage, married to Caroline's sister Eliza. The web caught them one more time. It couldn't hold this one. Freddie died there on August 27th, 1876, 9 months old. Laura's unpublished memoir records him plainly. The novels, he was never born. The series steps from Plum Creek to Silver Lake over his grave without breaking stride. Burr Oak. After Freddie, the family washed up in Burr Oak, Iowa, working a hotel for room and wages. Carolyn and the girls serving boarders, a saloon close enough to hear, the family's lowest documented year. Laura's little sister Grace was born there in the spring of 1877. By Laura's own later account, the family finally rolled out of town quietly, still owing money. An entire town, a birth, a year and a half. The novels delete Burr Oak so completely that generations of readers never knew the gap existed. The series simply skips 2 years and resumes out west, solvent and sunlit. The grandmothers, the laughing grandma of the maple sugar chapters, Laura Colby Ingalls, Polly's mother, died in October 1883. Grandma Charlotte, the Lake widow, followed in September 1884. 2 warm kitchens at the heart of the early books, 2 funerals, not a word of either, anywhere in the series, and the Quiners, 5 deaths, 1 family, 4 years. You have the full measure of that one already. Now the additions, because Laura did add darkness, and watch the kind. Jack. In the novels, the brindle bulldog pads faithfully beside the wagon for 7 years and 3 states, and dies a gentle storybook death on the very eve of the move to Dakota, one of the most wept-over scenes in American children's literature. By Laura's own unpublished telling, the real Jack was traded away with the ponies when she was a toddler. She invented a death. She gave a dog the tender, meaningful, on-the-page ending that 4 of her cousins never got, the Benders. In 1937, speaking to a book fair crowd in Detroit, Laura claimed her family had lived near the Bender clan, the Kansas serial killers whose orchard of corpses made national news in 1873, and that Pa had ridden out with the search party hunting them. Historians have checked the calendar. The Ingalls family left Kansas in 1871, before the Bender Inn was even doing its worst business. The story doesn't hold. She told it anyway, as fact, to a paying audience. Sit with that. She would attach her family to murder, invent proximity to the most lurid crime of the decade, when it made Pa taller in the saddle, and Mary. The book says scarlet fever took Mary's sight, and for 80 years America repeated it. When medical researchers finally worked the case in a pediatrics journal in 2013, the symptoms pointed instead to viral meningoencephalitis, a brain inflammation. That one isn't sinister. It's simplification, the era's shorthand for children. But it completes the picture of an author for whom the recorded fact was always negotiable in service of the telling. So sort the two piles and say the rule out loud. What got added? Dangers the family could beat. Wolves at the door, blizzards outlasted, killers escaped, and one invented dog death supplying clean, survivable grief at a chapter break. What got cut? Every loss with no comeback. The baby, the debt town, the funerals, the branch of the family that did everything right and got subtracted anyway. The frontier in the Little House books is allowed to threaten the family. Constantly, thrillingly. It is never once allowed to win. And Polly's last decade was nothing but the West winning 5 times in a row against the most careful people in the whole saga. Her story wasn't trimmed for length. It was inadmissible. It was the evidence against the verdict the books existed to deliver. Every memoirist curates. That's the trade. But what you've just watched isn't curation. A deleted town, a deleted brother, 2 deleted funerals, a deleted family, and an invented murder hunt to fill the space. The clean version of the frontier wasn't found. It was manufactured, plank by plank, from the lumber of omitted graves. But the Gulch did not get everyone. 3 of Polly's children walked out of Harney City alive, and what they built, and which Ingalls came knocking on their door a few years later, is the part of this story that nobody, anywhere, ever tells. December 1919. The Wyoming State Tribune out of Cheyenne runs a one-line business item. J.A. Quiner will build a large store building in Manderson on the lots he recently purchased from the Lincoln Land Office. J.A. Quiner, James Albert, Polly's middle son, the baby born on the shared farm 8 weeks before Mary Ingalls, the young man who dug graves on the Harney hillside at 20, the son who wrote Poor Mother is Dead to Wisconsin. 31 years after that letter, he's in the newspapers as a man buying commercial lots. Here's what happened to the remnant, and notice, because it's the last quiet lesson this family teaches, that the survivors rebuilt their lives on their parents' oldest pattern. When the Hills finally let him go, Albert came down to the Bighorn Basin of Wyoming with, in his own later telling, $65 and 5 horses. He married. The first marriage gave him 2 daughters and didn't hold. And the record hands us one strange, aching loop here, because his first wife took the girls and moved back to Pennington County, remarried, and settled in Keystone itself. The girls, Mary and Shirley, Polly's granddaughters, grew up in the boom town beside the hill where their grandmother lies, in the very years when the family stone still stood, alongside half-brothers born Townsend, who would themselves be buried in Keystone ground. The erased family's 3rd generation lived out ordinary American lives within walking distance of the graves the tourists never found. Albert in 1903 married again, Gertrude, a widow who ran a boarding house, and if your ears pricked at boarding house, they should. Feeding and housing working men for cash, the exact trade his father and Charlie and Louisa ran at the Silver Lake camp, the likeliest trade the family worked in Harney. The son built a respectable Wyoming life out of the same skill set that had carried the family up the mountain, except this time it worked. A 220-acre ranch, part owner and manager of a 2-story corner lot store in the town of Manderson, groceries, hardware and ranch outfitting downstairs, apartments and a little theatre upstairs, a director's seat at the Manderson State Bank, the careful man gene, Henry Quiner's gene, finally landing in a decade that didn't punish it. Louisa was already out there. She'd married a man named Frank Smith back in Minnesota. The records disagree politely about exactly when. and they ended up ranching in the same Bighorn country. And Lottie, the last daughter, married a rancher named Robert Sheldon and settled in the same county too. All three. One county. After everything you've heard tonight, Polly's surviving children gathered themselves back into a cluster you could ride across in a day. The Oconomowoc pattern, the shared quarter-section pattern, rebuilt on Wyoming grass by the three people who best knew what happens to this family when it scatters. And then comes the visit that closes a circle nobody in the books would even know was open. In the early 1900s, Carrie Ingalls, Laura's quiet younger sister, the middle girl that history keeps misplacing, went to Wyoming and lived for at least a year with the Quiner cousins. Think about who that is and where she went. Carrie was born on the Kansas Prairie at the bottom of the book's map and spent her life being everyone's afterthought. The sister, the series itself, barely develops. And when she needed somewhere to land as a young woman, she crossed the state line to the erased branch, to the children of Aunt Polly. The two least written people in this entire saga found each other in the Bighorn Basin, and you can read every Little House book ever printed and never learn it happened. The family knew things the franchise forgot. The web Polly helped weave in 1859, 3 weddings, 1 bloodline, was still catching family 45 years later, 4 states west. Albert outlasted everything. The ranch years, the store years, the bank years, then California in the 1930s, moving to Los Angeles at the exact moment a publishing phenomenon was making his childhood into America's bedtime story. When these happy golden years came out in 1943 and put Albert on the page as a boy in a piece of 1884 family news, the real Albert was 78 years old, living in Los Angeles, the boy who wrote "Poor Mother is Dead," grown into an old man, outliving the child version of himself that the books had just frozen in print. If he ever read himself, or his mother, in those pages, he left no comment that survives. He died in Los Angeles on February 22nd, 1947. The last of Harney City's sons was gone, which leaves only one thing still standing in this story: the Stones. And the Stones have their own ending, and it is not a kind one. You can drive there today. Take 1st Street Northeast out of Keystone, South Dakota, past the t-shirt shops and the fudge counters, against the flow of tour buses. A couple of miles on, turn right across a cattle gate onto a gravel track called Playhouse Road, then right again toward the water treatment plant. There will probably be cows. Walk up the hill to the south into the pines of the Black Hills National Forest, and look for faint paths and 3 sagging wire fences around old family plots. You're standing in the burial ground of Harney City, a town that no longer exists, serving a mine that lied, on land the law calls taken. Somewhere under that pine duff lie Henry Quiner, Charlie, George, Lillian, Ruby, Apiece, and Polly. Keystone itself only boomed after they were gone. New gold in 1891 built the town the Quiners never saw, and history gave it one more twist of the knife in 1927, when a sculptor named Gutzon Borglum set up his scaffolds on a granite mountain a few miles from the cemetery and spent 14 years carving 4 presidents' faces into it, 60 feet tall, so that the American story would be visible from space and safe from forgetting. The road to Mount Rushmore runs through Keystone. Between 2 and 3 million people a year, fudge in hand, drive within a few minutes of Polly's Hill to look at the national memory in granite, and not one in 100,000 knows the hill is there. Even the names up here got revised, eventually. The great summit the Tin Company and the dead town were named for, Harney Peak, after a general whose record against the Lakota does not survive polite description, was formally renamed Black Elk Peak in 2016, the government conceding at last whose holy ground this had been. Names get corrected on the mountains. Down on the cemetery hill there are no names left to correct. The family, you'll remember, had bought permanence. The nice monument from Albert's letter, a proper cut stone family marker, stood over the graves with small footstones bearing each person's initials. HOQ for Henry, RAQ for little Ruby, stones for the others, Polly's initials in the grass. Here is what the record of those stones looks like in our own lifetime. Over the decades, the abandoned cemetery was vandalised, repeatedly, until the people of Keystone carried the main Quiner monument down the hill for its own protection and put it on display in the town's old schoolhouse museum, where it sits today. A family gravestone in a museum case, a short walk from the ticket lines for Rushmore tours, labelled and lit, miles from the people it was bought to mark. The town that grew up after the Quiners died is now the careful keeper of the only monument they could afford. The footstones stayed on the hill. In 2006, a Keystone historian photographed Ruby's little RAQ stone, still in place after 120 years. In 2009, in town, as it happens for Keystone's Summer Festival, named after the old Holy Terror gold mine, researchers walked back up to check. The flat foundation slab where the family monument once stood was still there. The footstones were gone, not buried as far as anyone could determine, not toppled in the grass. Gone, most likely carried off, one souvenir at a time, by persons unknown. The researcher who documented this family for decades ended her account of that visit with an open plea that is still posted today. If you have been to the cemetery and located the Quiner stones, please write. Nobody has written, so now we're standing where this video began, on the hill at the empty foundation. And you have everything you need to answer the question from the top of the hour. You were told the Little House books were the record of a family. You now know there were two records. The published one, which gave Aunt Polly a butcher knife, gave her son a fable, gave the family a wave goodbye toward Montana, and then went silent while 5 of them went into a hillside, because their true story would have broken the story America was buying, and the real one. A courtroom line in Concord, a deed for half of one farm, Census rows, 91 pages of letters in a Wisconsin archive, with one page that historians hold their breath over, a monument in a glass case, a plea for missing stones that no one has answered in 17 years. Polly Ingalls Quiner, born October 14th, 1840. Married at 18, the first knot in the web that made the Little House family possible. A wife and mother on 5 frontiers, Wisconsin, Missouri, Minnesota, Dakota, and the one no map names. The distance between what happened and what got told. 7 children, and a decade in which she buried 4 of them and her husband in a gulch she was trying to save her way out of, writing politely east the whole time, apologizing for the delay. The mountain 4 miles away remembers 4 presidents, so the country will never forget its story. The books remember a knife, a liar, and a wave. And the only address Polly ever wrote down for her family's future, the only one where all of them can still be found together, is the one she set on paper the day before Thanksgiving, 1884. Where parting is no more.